Welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Are You Ready? Are You FDA Ready? Key Requirements and Enforcement for Food Facilities. I'm proud to introduce Fabiola Negron, Registrar Corps Director of Food Safety, who will be leading this webinar. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Microbiology and graduate coursework in Food Science and Technology from the University of Puerto Rico. Since joining Registrar Corp in 2016, her team has reviewed and developed over 2,000 food safety plans across HACCP, food defense, FSVP, etc. for food FDA compliance. Throughout this webinar, feel free to write any questions in the Q&A box as we've saved time at the end to answer them. We'll also follow up with a link to the recording so you can refer back to this at any time. Without any further ado, Fabiola, take it away.
Thank you so much, Alexis, for the introduction. Before we begin, I'd like to talk about what Registrar Corp does. It is likely that we have assisted some of you already by registering your facility with the FDA, reviewing your food safety plans or labels, or maybe helped you petition a removal from import alert. Registrar Corp is the global leader in FDA regulatory compliance. For over 20 years, we have helped companies in the food, supplement, cosmetic, drug, and medical device industries with the FDA requirements. We have assisted over 30,000 clients across 190 countries, and we have about 20 offices worldwide to provide support in your respective time zone and languages. We offer services and software solutions to address your needs with a high rating of client satisfaction. Our specialists are highly qualified and experienced to give you adequate advice and navigate the complexities of the FDA requirements with you to help you achieve compliance. We are also ISO 27001 certified to ensure that the data and information that you share with us is protected. We thank you for joining us today and for choosing us as your trusted FDA compliance resource. So in this webinar, I will be sharing some practical information and insights for food and beverage facilities about FDA registrations, food safety requirements, food labeling, prior notice for imported foods, and how the FDA enforces these regulations. As my colleague explained, we will give you opportunity for a Q&A session at the end, and feel free to use the question feature at any time to drop your questions. So we'll begin with the FDA registrations. A food facility registration, or FFR, is required for all facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food, including beverages and dietary supplements. It applies to foods intended for humans and/or animals. And when registering your facility, you are letting the FDA know that you are producing a food that will be consumed in the United States. A registration must be renewed every 2 even years biennially. This year, 2020, for renewal that passed, we just renewed the registrations with FDA, and the next one will be in 2026. Renewal must be completed by December 31st of this year, of the next year of 2026. And however, if any of the information in the FFR changes before it is renewal time, it can be updated in the FDA's FURLS system, FURLS system. Information such as products processed at the facility can change over time, so the FFR information must be kept current with this type of information. Facilities outside of the United States must also designate a U.S. agent for FDA communications in order to complete the registration process. No U.S. agent means no registration. In registering, you are also consenting, giving the authority to the FDA to come and inspect your facility. A newer requirement for the food facility registrations is to also have a unique facility identifier. So far, the FDA has only approved the use of a Duns and Bradstreet number, or DUNS for short. This number is assigned after Duns and Bradstreet verify that your facility is a legitimate business. There have been cases where non-existent locations would be registered with the FDA, which put consumers at risk when the origin of the food cannot be traced. The DUNS is needed per facility location. It is location specific. So if you have multiple facilities to register, each would need their own DUNS number. It is simpler for a facility in the United States to obtain a DUNS, and it gets more complex in certain countries. It is not a quick process, as it can take up to 45 days for a DUNS to be issued, as they gather the information and conduct the verification of that business. It is important to know that Duns and Bradstreet is not part of the FDA. They are simply verifying that you have a legitimate business. There are some common misconceptions about the FDA, and we will break some of them down today. So we often see companies state that they are FDA approved. This information and FDA's logo is up on their website, on their labels, marketing materials, or certification type documents they distribute to buyers or the public. This practice is not allowed. It is prohibited to say that your food product or your facility is FDA approved. The FDA can take action when they see this practice. Being registered with the FDA does not mean that you have been approved. That process does not require a verification of your practices. It does not review any food safety documentation. It does not review any product specifications. So the FDA is not evaluating your facility at that point. So as I shared before, the registration will only notify the FDA about your operation, the foods that you manufacture, process, pack, or hold, and invites them to inspect you at any time. As a general rule, the FDA, again I repeat, does not approve any specific food product or facility. They, however, approve food additives and color additives that are added to food. They have specifications and conditions of use for these in the regulations, in the CFR. Additives approved for use in other countries may not be the same as those approved in the United States. It is important to check the regulations when formulating your products for the US market. However, if you produce additives in the list that FDA has provided, it does not mean that your product is FDA approved either. It means that you are in compliance with the specifications of that product according to FDA regulations. The FDA approves use of additives in food, but the product itself from your brand or your company is, that does not tie FDA approval to your product. So it's important to know that difference. Now, when it comes to color additives, the FDA has a process for certifying batches of color additives. FDA color batch certification. This means that the FDA did review your batch, they evaluated, conducted testing to ensure that it meets the specifications in the CFR. In this case, you do have a certificate, acknowledging that that batch of color, that specific batch, has been evaluated by the FDA and meets the specifications in the regulation. FDA does not approve food and ingredients, food facilities, food processes, dietary supplements, medical foods, infant formula, food labels and nutrition facts, or structure function claims. So it's important that when you're marketing your product, if you're FDA registered, that simply means that you have submitted your information to the FDA and they know who you are. It does not mean that they've evaluated your procedures, approved your products, or reviewed the safety of your facility's operations. Another important FDA registration that may apply to some of you is the Food Canning Establishment Registration, or FCE. Food facilities that process low-acid canned foods or acidified foods must register as an FCE in addition to having the FFR and the DUNS number. Both FFR and FCE registrations will be linked, and the information about the operation must match across the 3 submissions to ensure that the registrations go through without issue. Errors or differences in the address or names in the FFR, FCE, or DUNS can result in the registration being suspended. So these registrations will require certain information that must match across the three submissions. And if there are any errors or mistakes or differences in these components, then it might bring issues with your registration. The manufacturers of these foods are also required to submit their scheduled process to the FDA for each individual product. So the FDA will assign a product SID number. The SID number is required prior to distributing low acid canned food or acidified food products, and the scheduled process describes the parameters and conditions applied to ensure that the products have achieved commercial sterility. Without an SID, the product cannot be distributed or imported to the United States. So this SID number, we mentioned it is specific for each individual product. What this means is if you have canned tuna in an aluminum can, you also have it in pouch. Those two require two different SIDs because the packaging type changes. Now, if you have a canned tuna for 1 pound, or different types of sizes of canned tuna, that would also require a different SID. So it is important that when changes in the packaging, in the formulation, in the size of the container, the dimensions of the container, all those changes impact how the scheduled process needs to be applied, and it will require a different SID number. Now, typical products covered under FCE are shelf-stable and hermetically sealed products. They can be packaged in pouches, in cans, in carton, and glass jars. So it is important that you identify if your products are low-acid foods, meaning the pH is above 4.6 and water activity exceeds 0.85. Those are low acid foods. Now, acidified foods are low acid foods for which the acid is added onto them to lower the pH below 4.6. So that is the difference. Identify, take a moment, and try to see if this is something that is applicable to you. Now, there are certain exemptions of facilities that need to be registered with the FDA. Registration is only required for facilities that come into direct physical contact with food. So sales or headquarter offices and trading companies are exempt from registration requirements, as are personal residences, transportation companies, farms, retail food establishments, fishing vessels that do not engage in processing on board the vessel, and facilities that are entirely regulated by the USDA. So if any of you engage solely in these practices, you are not required to register with the FDA. We see this often that a headquarter office registers and they think that they can just have one registration for the headquarters and that covers their 6 processing facilities. No, you have to register your 6 processing facilities, and the headquarters does not need to register because they are not physically handling the food. Now we continue with the food safety requirements, my favorite part. So when producing foods for the U.S. market, you must ensure that they are processed in compliance with the applicable food safety regulations, and there are quite a few regulations to consider. The safety of both human and animal foods sold or distributed in interstate commerce, which includes imported food, falls under FDA jurisdiction. Domestic and foreign facilities are subject to the exact same food safety requirements. The requirements will vary based upon the type of food or activities that are conducted. Also, certain financial criteria in some cases can impact which regulations uh, are applicable to you. You may be subject to certain exemptions because of being a small, very small business. Then meat, poultry, and egg products out of shell are subject to the USDA. And in the case of alcoholic beverages, these fall under the TTB and are excluded from FDA food safety requirements. So in general, foods and beverages for humans and animals, including ingredients and additives, processed foods, seafood, fresh produce, dietary supplement, eggs in shell, and non-specified meat or poultry fall under FDA jurisdiction. And both domestic and foreign food facilities are subject to the same requirements. If you manufacture, process, pack, or hold food for U.S. consumption within FDA jurisdiction, you are subject to the regulations. And if you are in the United States and engage in interstate commerce, you're selling or distributing outside of your state, or are importing foods, then you also are covered by FDA requirements. Farms are also subject to FDA regulations, even though they do not have to register. They are still subject to FDA requirements, and some might be subject to produce safety rule. So it's important to know that even though farms don't need to register, if they are solely engaging in harvesting and growing and harvesting of food, then they still have to meet certain FDA requirements if they are growing and harvesting covered produce. So the food and beverage regulations are found in Title 21 of the CFR. And CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations. This is where the FDA regulations reside and what FDA uses to enforce. So here we will highlight some of the regulations to show where you can find some of the most common or important requirements that might apply to you. But you must do thorough research, or if that's too much for you, but you can hire someone like us to do it, preferably us. So you can rest assured that you have identified all the right requirements and that you covered all your bases when it comes to your specific product and operation. So there can be variations of which regulations apply to you based on the types of food and what operations you engage in. So we have here juice HACCP and seafood HACCP. We have thermally processed low acid foods, acidified foods, CGMPs for infant formula, processing of bottled water. These are just some examples of, there might be specific product types that have their specific regulations, such as dietary supplements and bottled water. That's a very specific commodity. And then we have others that are more broad, like acidified foods. Acidified foods, it could include a food that is also subject to seafood HACCP, for example. So canned tuna, well, not canned tuna. Let's see, an acidified food. Let's say a pickled product. It may be subject to various regulations at the same time. So in canned tuna, it can be a low acid canned food, LACF, and seafood HACCP. So you might be subject to more than one regulation. Here we have more examples that came about with the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. This brought forth more requirements and included other persons in the supply chain to ensure food safety throughout the different stages in the supply chain. So, for example, before FSMA, only seafood and juice were required to have HACCP plans. So the HACCP plans now are also required, or food safety plans, for facilities that are subject to the preventive controls rule. And food safety plans go a little beyond what a HACCP plan covers. So it is more encompassing of other activities that were not considered critical in a HACCP system. So it goes beyond that. So the FDA required these food safety plans and other programs to be in place to ensure food safety and food defense. In addition, requirements extend from just food facilities into fresh produce farms, U.S. importers, and food transport vehicles. So before, these areas were not heavily regulated, with specific requirements, and these have given new requirements and new guidance for industry to ensure food safety. So here we see we have the preventive controls for humans and animal food. We have produce safety that applies for farms of fresh fruits and vegetables, including certain herbs and nuts. So these are the ones that are typically consumed raw. So if your produce must be cooked before consumption, it would not fall under produce safety. Foreign supplier verification program, which applies to the U.S. importers. Intentional adulteration rule or food defense, which applies to food facilities for human food only, not animal food. Then sanitary transportation applies to the shippers, receivers, loaders, and carriers who transfer food in the United States. And food traceability is a new requirement that is still pending enforcement for January 2026. And this will require specific records for persons who manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods that appear on the food traceability list, which are foods that FDA has considered higher risk due to outbreak data and recall data. So in this simplified diagram, we wanted to give you an idea of the plans or programs required per general food type. As I mentioned, through research of the regulation, a thorough research of the regulations must be conducted to ensure that you have implemented all the applicable food safety requirements. And some foods, as I mentioned as well, can be covered by a combination of regulations. As we saw in the previous tables, there may be regulations for specific types of food categories, but various CGMPs requirements can also apply. So for example, infant formula would be subject to their specific CGMPs and the preventive controls for human food, which requires having a written food safety plan. And like that, there are other combinations. You could have an acidified juice. You could have a you could have um, a low acid food that is also subject to seafood, or animal food that is also subject to low acid canned foods. So there can be various combinations. You just have to understand the characteristics of your product, of whether they fall under this low acid or acidified regulation, and know if they are a dietary supplement, if they are a human food, or if they fall in an animal food category, so that you can follow the proper requirements. So these documents are not required for every food establishment. So food safety plans or programs have certain exemptions. For example, a facility of human foods does not need to have a food safety plan and supply chain program if its annual sales and market value of the food they manufacture, process, pack, or hold is less than $1 million in US dollars. This must account for the sales and market value of any food and includes subsidiaries and affiliates. So we can go into more detail in our subsequent webinar, but it's important to know that if you meet the criteria for the different modified requirements, an attestation must be submitted to the FDA to benefit from this exemption. Otherwise, you will be subject to the full requirements. It is an expected practice for industry to have some sort of food safety or HACCP plan in place, and it is good to have that. Even if FDA gives you certain exemptions, that doesn't mean that your client or your customer will. So if you have a business relationship and your buyer requires you to have, on-site audits, or requires you to have a food safety plan, then we still recommend that you have that because it obviously opens more doors in the market, even though FDA would allow you certain exemptions. So exempt from the FDA plans or programs, we have retail establishments. They're not subject to the FDA. Alcoholic beverages and USDA regulated products, we mentioned they're under another agency's jurisdiction, so they will not require having these plans or programs. Farms are not required to have a food safety plan. However, it is recommended. If you can have a food safety plan, it is recommended that you have a farm food safety plan. Warehouses are not required to have a food safety plan because there's no handling of the food or manufacturing and processing involved. Only engaging in storage, unless you are storing refrigerated products, you don't need to have a plan. Now, if you're refrigerating products for safety, let's say you're storing dairy products, that requires refrigeration for safety, then you will have a modified plan where you're only controlling the temperature of your coolers, monitoring that temperature to ensure that there's no temperature abuse. But other than that, a warehouse solely engaged in storing foods or shelf stable foods, they would not require a food safety plan. We mentioned modified requirements. Qualified facilities are those that fall, or very small businesses are those that have that financial criteria below 1 million for human foods and below 2.5 million for animal food. So if you fall within that, you are subject to certain exemptions. And then for food defense, very small businesses, the threshold is $10 million. Let's remember that animal food is not subject to food defense. This is only applicable for humans, for human foods. And yeah, I think I had another thought on food defense, but I just forgot. That's okay. It'll come to me. But yeah, the modified requirements for food defense apply to businesses 10 million or more. And I remember now because it's a larger scale, it's a larger scope of, consumers that will be consuming that product. So when you have that reach, then you would fall under the food defense requirements. Then we move on to the food labeling requirements. So in addition to the food being safe for consumers, the foods that you're producing, the products must also be labeled in compliance with the food labeling requirements found in 21 CFR 101. The FDA sets the requirements for where information needs to be placed on the label, information on what information goes on the different sides of the packaging, the specifications for the units of measure used, and others. So they also have requirements for how ingredients and additives must be listed or declared. So we will go over the list of mandatory requirements. So we have the statement of identity, which is the common name of the food. We have the net quantity statement, which states the amount of the product that is in that packaging. The list of ingredients, which includes each ingredient used in the formulation in order of predominance. Also, there are some requirements for how certain ingredients need to be listed on the label. For example, a color that is from the color additive list requiring approval. So the FD&C colors, they must be from a certified batch and they must be listed as FD&C yellow number 5 or FD&C yellow number 6. So they have specific requirements. When the batches are not certified, it may appear as sunset yellow or some other name. So it is important to follow FDA requirements for color batch certification and the listing of that product, of that color. Then we have allergen statements. if applicable. So if your product contains any of the 9 major allergens identified by the FDA, they must be declared on the label. These are milk, soy, wheat, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, crustaceans, shellfish, and sesame. So, for example, for tree nuts, fish, and crustacean shellfish, you must also identify the specific type of tree nut fish or crustacean shellfish present in the food. You can't just say fish. You have to say it's tuna, it's mackerel, it's salmon. Like for tree nuts, it's hazelnut, it is chestnuts, or you have to specify the specific tree nuts. And for crustacean shellfish, it's crab, it's lobster, it's shrimp. So you have to keep that in mind because the individuals can be allergic to a specific type of nutfish or shellfish, not necessarily all of them. So that must be declared. There are 2 different ways that allergens can be declared. They can be in the ingredient list only, or they can be listed in the ingredient list and in a contained statement. But it's important that the information matches if you're putting them in both, but it must be properly named and listed in the ingredients list. Then other mandatory declarations include who the manufacturer, distributor, or packer is. Not all 3, you have to choose at least one because this identifies who is responsible for that product, and it alerts the consumer, if something were to happen, if there's an illness, if there's a complaint, the person can contact the proper business and have that resolved, as well as FDA can identify who they need to contact when these issues arise. So either the manufacturer, distributor, or packer can be identified on the label. Then the country of origin where the food came from. And for FDA and customs purposes, this is a requirement for both. Then any additional languages, this is very important. We see this often. The label for the United States must be in English. It must have the English language. We understand there can be products with multiple languages on the label. However, all the mandatory food label declarations must be in all the languages that are present on the label. So sometimes, specifically, I believe in Europe, there can be German and French and Italian all in one label. So that's a lot of languages in one product label, and the space is limited. So for the United States, first and foremost, make sure that if it's in that all of the mandatory food label declarations are in English, and if there's space for a different language, then all those mandatory declarations must also be in that other language of your choosing. But English is the most important language for the US market, and it must be all the required information needs to be in English. Then we have the nutrition facts panel. Unless there's an exemption, there are some products that are exempt from a nutrition facts panel, but in nutritional information must be included about the food per serving. It is important to know and search the regulations and what the FDA requires for a serving. This can vary per country as well. Then includes the content of calories, fat, carbohydrates, protein, sodium, or other. And the requirements may vary per the type of food. So bulk products don't need a nutrition facts panel, for example. The labeling for the consumer does. So, and there are certain products that, given their nutritional values, like the FDA does have certain exemptions. So if you have any concerns about which label requirements apply to you, or if your labels are compliant, we can also help you with that. And here we can see some of the examples for nutrition fact label formats. The FDA is very particular about the serving sizes, the font type, the font size. This is to ensure that the specific details are more visible and to ensure uniformity where the information is found, so the consumers know exactly where to find the information consistently. There are certain foods that are exempt from having nutrition facts labeling, as I mentioned, and these also include fresh fruits and vegetables. And the products with insignificant amount of nutrients such as coffee, tea, and spices may also be exempt. So spices on their own may be exempt, but if it's a blend that includes other ingredients, then it might not be exempt. So you have to be sure you understand what applies to your product. So if you are exporting foods to the United States, you're in a non-US country, then you must submit what is called a prior notice. And this prior notice is to notify the FDA in advance of any shipments that you are sending to the US that are meant for consumption by humans or animals. And these are required for most imported foods. So imported foods for commercial purposes, and this includes samples. When you do not file a prior notice, the FDA will hold your product. It will be detained at the port of entry, and that prior notice must include information about the shipment and the facility that manufactured processed that food. So if you are simply a distributor, that's not the information that you would give at entry for a prior notice. You would have to identify who was the manufacturer processor of that product. The prior notice can be filed by an exporter, an importer, or a third party. Registrar Corp also assists in submitting prior notices, and we make that process seamless for you. There are certain exemptions of products for personal use, meat and poultry, egg products, and products exported without leaving the port of arrival until export. So there are some exemptions, but most foods for commercial purposes, including samples, are required to submit a prior notice. Now here we show you when those prior notices must be submitted. So for shipments arrivals by road, it's 2 hours. By rail is 4 hours before. By air is also 4 hours before. By water, it's 8 hours before. And by international mail before the food is shipped. So you should not submit a prior notice more than 15 calendar days before the anticipated date of arrival. So we just discussed these hours, which are the minimum that you should wait, but then it should not be more than 50 calendar days prior to the shipment's arrival. And now let's go into how the FDA enforces these requirements. So how does the US FDA enforce the regulations? They have importer inspections. They also have food facility inspections, and they also conduct product sampling. So under the importer inspections, we mentioned that we have the FSVP rule for US importers. Also, there is a regulation under HACCP that covers importer verifications for juice and seafood. So juice HACCP has importer requirements, and seafood HACCP regulation has their own importer requirements. So they are similar, but they do have differences. So it's important to know that. And the FDA visits these importers to review their verification records. Importers are required to verify their foreign suppliers' compliance. So any food that they're bringing into the United States, they have to give assurances that the foreign suppliers are following the FDA requirements. So if I am importing, let's say, a beverage, I, as the importer, have to verify that my foreign supplier is complying with the preventive controls rule for human food. And I also have to verify that the label for allergens is correct. This helps ensure that the food I am bringing into the country is safe for consumption. And the FDA will verify any records that I have and my FSVP or my importer verification program to ensure I have procedures on how I do that, how I verify my suppliers, how I evaluate them, how I approve them, then that I did all the evaluations necessary under the rule to make sure that they were following FDA requirements. I have to document all of that. And then I have to document all verification activities that I conduct to ensure they maintain compliance with FDA throughout the year. This gives the FDA a window into the foreign supplier's compliance status. The FDA has limited resources and they cannot inspect every facility that is registered with them. It's thousands, thousands, thousands of facilities. So they do not have that capacity. So by making importers responsible for verifying their foreign suppliers' compliance, they actually have a way, a simpler way of getting a sneak peek into what the foreign suppliers compliance looks like. And importer inspections can be on site. They can visit the importer's office or headquarters, or they can do it remotely. They can just inspect them via video call. So that's also a way of utilizing resources more efficiently because they don't have to travel to get that information. Then, oh, and another thing I will say, it's important to be aware of your importer's requirements because they are required to ask you for verification documents. That can include verifying your food safety plan, requesting audit reports for their review, requesting sampling and testing, monitoring records of specific preventive controls or CCPs. So it's important that you are willing to share that because if they can't comply with FSVP, they can be shut down by the FDA. They can be placed on import alert if they are not following FSVP. And this means that you just lost your client or your customer because you did not cooperate. So we understand there's certain information we want to keep confidential, but as much as possible, comply with FSVP requirements so that your importer can continue doing business and be compliant as well. Then we have facility inspections, which are on site only. The FDA can only conduct inspections, official inspections on site. They will visit and an inspector will observe the operations, the equipment, the conditions of the equipment, the processes, the adequacy of the processes, and also of your food safety practices. And they will also conduct a records review where they will verify your food safety or HACCP plan to make sure that it is adequate, that it addresses the proper hazards and controls. And they can also verify monitoring records. They will interview your employees to make sure that they know what they have to do at the different CCPs and that they understand their role within that, the importance of that. So it's pretty thorough. They can be there from 2 to 5 days. Inspections can be longer depending on the type of facility, operations, the products that they want to inspect. And foreign facilities get about a 3-month advance notice of inspections, different from domestic, which happen immediately. They can just show up at the facility and conduct an inspection. But because foreign travel requires planning and confirmation, certain confirmations so that they can ensure that your facility exists, that you are in operation. It's not a seasonal production. So that coordination requires planning. So they give you about a 3 months advance notice. Then product sampling at the port of entry, or a product on the market, they can grab a sample and just test it for contaminants or adulteration. So at the port of entry, they have as well limited resources, but if they detain your product, they see labels are not compliant, They further test for other, they can further test for contaminants. They can test for misbranding. There have been cases where product has been refused because they do not meet the vitamin C content that the label stated it would have. So 100% vitamin C, it came back as 75% vitamin C. Okay, this is misbranded. So they will test for that sort of thing, including like pesticide residues, unapproved additives. Like I mentioned, if you have unapproved colors, that's also something they could test at the port of entry. So the first thing that they can see at that port of entry is the labels. They can't tell if your product is contaminated simply by a visual inspection. So, having labels comply with FDA is also an important step in ensuring that, your business operations are not disrupted by refusals or, having to destroy your product. So then, compliance, non-compliance has its consequences. Your products can go from just simply being detained to then the FDA issuing an import refusal. Your product can be detained, FDA inspects it, everything's fine, they'll release that shipment and nothing happened because detentions are a routine process for the FDA. However, when it's detained and compliance concerns are discovered, then these shipments can be refused. If your products are constantly refused, it could lead up to an import alert. And an import alert is where the FDA just detains the product without examining it and will automatically refuse it if you do not present evidence that that product is safe. For example, you have been placed on import alert for salmonella in black pepper. That shipment came, but you submitted to the FDA. Here is my documentation that the product is safe. We have certificates of analysis. We have other evidence. They review that and they can release the shipment. So if you want to be put out of import alert, which we recommend and know that you likely will because that requires additional verification. It's an additional stop that your product has to make. You might miss product deadlines. Your customers waiting for that product. You're submitting additional testing all the time. So it becomes very costly for you to be on import alert. So FDA will require at least 5 compliant shipments, and this is oversimplified because the process is way more complicated, but you have to submit, have 5 compliant shipments within an extended period of time. It cannot be the same week, for example, so that's the complexity of it. But once you have 5 compliant shipments, you can submit a petition to the FDA where you provide all the evidence of the practices that you have, your food safety plan, testing procedures or quality control procedures to address and demonstrate that that contaminant is no longer in your product, or depending on what the import alert is for, because there's thousands of import alerts as well. But ultimately, it can be very detrimental to your business to be placed on import alerts. So the important or the key thing here is to be proactive and prevent from ever getting on import alert. Have your food safety practices on point to make sure that you don't have any issues with that. So this is when the shipments are stopped at the port. But when a facility is inspected, excuse me, I need some water. When a facility is inspected, they will issue observations at the end if there's any, and this is called a 483. A Form 483 is when the FDA inspected your facility and noted deficiencies. They are giving you a citation for non-complying with a specific part of the regulation. And they will list that in this form. The FDA will not list absolutely every observation, but they will focus on the major ones. And if when you're issued this 483, then uh, if you don't, you will be given 15 business days to reply to the FDA with your corrective actions. So if your citation was you did not develop a food safety plan for your products, then you will respond, what have you done to correct that? Did you get training for your employee to be a PCQI, Preventive Controls Qualified Individual, and they are going to write a food safety plan? We will have it ready by this date. We've already taken the steps to conduct a hazard analysis. Like you have to explain and provide evidence of the steps that you are taking. Then the FDA will evaluate that and say, okay, it seems like it's good. We'll follow up with you, I don't know, in a month to see if your food safety plan is ready. They can decide that, or they can say, okay, this is enough evidence. You have fixed the issues. We'll see you in the next inspection. So it just depends on the case. If you do not respond to the 43, or your response is not effective, adequate, then they, or as well, if the observations are serious enough, you can have a warning letter. And a warning letter is, a more serious, step by the FDA, and they are going to detail what happened, like what were the observations, and they're going to prompt you to provide corrective actions again. They will also give you 15 business days to respond. Oh, I mean 15 days to respond, not business days, just 15 days. And you will have to detail again what measures are you taking to address the issues. So 483's observations are very general, but the warning letter goes into more detail about what the FDA is expecting you to do. They won't give you specific parameters, but they will give you more information about what they are hoping you to achieve. And then when that doesn't happen again, they can also place you on import alert. There's import alerts because, seafood is not processed according to the seafood HACCP regulations, or you did not have a seafood HACCP plan, well, you're not following seafood HACCP requirements. There are import alerts because of, salmonella in products, listeria ready-to-eat food. There are import alerts for a bunch of things: pesticide residues in produce, or pesticide residues in food, animal drugs in milk, or, there are a lot of import alert types out there. Again, prevention is key, being proactive. If you are newer to exporting to the United States, it is highly recommended, strongly recommended that you have somebody with the experience and with FDA regulations to look over your food safety plan to make sure that you have covered the proper regulations. Also, look at your labels to ensure that they're following FDA requirements. The label is in English. It contains all the mandatory components, that all the food safety practices are in place so that you're ready for an inspection. So there are multiple components that you would have to cover to make sure that you don't have, that you prevent or reduce the risk of having observations when you encounter FDA. So in addition to the enforcement steps, these enforcement steps can also have a direct impact in your business. Why? The FDA publishes these enforcement actions in their website. So they have an FDA data dashboard. If you Google that, or you search for that, you will see that you can search a firm's information, or a firm's FDA compliance history, and you will see if your business had a warning letter, if you've received a 483, classification of your inspections. So the results of inspections, you can see import refusals, any type of FDA enforcement action. So before this was created, you sort of could go under the radar. Nobody would know that FDA inspected you and that you had a 483 issued, or that you had observations. So you got, your business pretty much got out scotch-free. But now it is public. Anybody in the world with access to the internet can see this information, and it can have a detrimental effect in your business relationships. So if you're hoping to maintain a healthy FDA compliance history to make sure that your competitors or your buyers see that information and use it against you, it's important that you are proactive and have preventive measures in place. So, like we mentioned, it can have these implications in your business. And when, for example, you are detained and the product is found to have issues, then you will have detention fees or port fees for them having to hold your product for a longer time. You are charged for that. If your label was not compliant and your product has to be relabeled at the port, then they're going to be relabeling fees plus reconditioning fees, and also the FDA charges for having to reinspect your product after they detained it. So if more resources are utilized or more warehousing time is needed, those pile up as your product is detained for more time at the port. Then again, if your product has a compliance concern that cannot be fixed, you have a product that was not processed according to the low acid canned food regulation, FDA will deem that adulterated, that you cannot fix that product. It's done. It's gonna be refused, and you're gonna be required to destroy it. In some cases, they won't let you even return it. We had a histamine case for a seafood product where the FDA said, no, this needs to be destroyed. We're not sending this back to your country because it's not safe for anyone to consume this product. So you have to destroy it. So preventing that is important. And then indirect costs, like we mentioned, it can impact your business. It can impact business relationships. So your reputation can be at risk if you have a long history of import refusals or labeling concerns. That can impact because you can be seen as not reliable, right? They can't trust that you have food safety practices in place that ensure the safety of the food. So it's important that we consider, FDA compliance is critical for having a successful business in the United States. Then, we've mentioned all these different requirements. I know it's a lot, and this is just an overview of the FDA requirements. In our subsequent webinars, we're also going to touch upon different aspects that we just briefly summarized today. But how can Registrar Corp help you? We can provide, we have a full range of services at a fixed fee that include registration and U.S. agent service. We can register your facility and be your U.S. agent, and that includes other things as well, or other benefits. We can conduct courtesy reviews for your labels and food safety plans, and assist you with detentions and that type of assistance. Some at a reduced fee because you are our U.S. agent client. So if you are a U.S. agent client currently, call us and see what benefits you have because of being our U.S. agent client. Then the food safety compliance services, those are the ones that are under me. My team is amazing. They are highly qualified. They are all PCQIs, HACCP trained, food defense trained. We have all the FDA training in addition to having food scientists in our team. So we know FDA regulations, we understand food science and food safety, and we're ready to assist you. We develop or review plans and programs required by the FDA, like the ones we mentioned today. We can do checks to guide you in the right direction if you just need a little guidance, or we can write the whole plan for you if you require more detailed assistance. And our team also provides mock FDA inspection services. So if you're preparing for an FDA inspection, one of our specialists can travel to your facility or have a virtual inspection and make sure that you're following GMPs, that you have food safety plans or HACCP plans that are adequate. So they will pretend to be FDA for a couple of days and inspect your facility, provide you with a report with observations to guide you and tell you what needs to be changed or fixed in order to meet the compliance requirements. Our plans and programs include food safety plans, supply chain program, recall plans, food defense plans, HACCP for seafood and juice. We are experts in those regulations. Then we have the label compliance services, which also has very qualified persons to review your labels. Again, a check just to see, guide you in the right direction. But if you require more detailed assistance, we have label development or our label comply service, which develops a label in compliance with the FDA. We have FSBP agent services. So if you're exporting product to the United States without a U.S. buyer, without a U.S. owner, then you will need an FSBP agent. You must have a person that, as FSBP importer, verifies your compliance. And if you don't have an FSBP importer, then your product cannot enter the United States. So if you think or have more questions about that, give us a call and we'll gladly answer your questions about FSBP agent. And we also have detention assistance and import alert petition submissions services. So we can submit these petitions for you, guide you along the way. This is a very lengthy and complex process because there's a lot of documentation and evidence that you're going to have to demonstrate to the FDA, as well as having those 5 compliant shipments, like I mentioned. So if you're new to this process and need assistance, we are more than happy to help you. And we have our hourly consulting. So if you have any questions that fall outside of what a plan or program development or check might be, you have specific questions about a particular regulation, or you have a problem that you're trying to fix regarding food safety or your labels, give us a call and we can schedule some consulting, hourly consulting with you. And for attendees only, we have a 20% off any of the following services: our food facility registration and U.S. agent services, as well as any food safety and label service. And it's only valid for 1 month. So it should actually say 4/13. I apologize. No, actually 3/13. So it's valid till 3/13. But it's okay. We'll leave it until 4/6 because that's what it says there. I'm not going to back out. We're happy to assist you, and feel free to contact us. So we have for next month our second webinar. So if you didn't know, this is a 4-part series for food and beverage compliance. So today we just went over a summary of all the potential food safety requirements and label requirements and food facility registration requirements. But in our next webinar, we will go over our blueprint for FDA food safety, essential plans and programs. So we will discuss what is required of food safety plans, supply chain program, recall plans, HACCP plans, and food defense plans. So if you're a food facility manufacturer and processor, these plans apply to you. So please, come again, attend our webinar on March 6th, and we are, happy to continue being your FDA compliance resource. It is at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, March 6th. And let's see. So before we go into the Q&A, I will remind you that we have a post-webinar survey. And we really, encourage you to fill this survey because we want to continue improving our webinars, and we want to know if you enjoyed the material, you found it useful, it was relevant to you. So it's important that you give us that feedback so that we can give you material that you really want to see. And now we will go into the Q&A portion. Ooh, we have quite a few questions to go over. I like that. So the session is being recorded, and you will receive a recording at the end. We will email each of you with the recording of the webinar. Uh, I don't think we have subtitles in Spanish, but we do have, plan to, we do provide this webinar series in Spanish as well. It will just be in a different schedule. So if you want to receive the emails for the Spanish version, then just let us know and we can email that, we can add you to that list so that you receive the invitation for registration. Okay, so we have Lauren Daniels is asking, what is the legal weight of an FDA guidance document given that it only expresses FDA's current thinking? For example, in the new allergen guidance document, coconut is no longer considered an allergen. Does that mean that manufacturers need to update all labels to exclude coconut? Well, yes. So coconut will no longer be one of the 9 major allergens. It will not fall under the tree nut category any longer. So if your product has coconut, then labels must be revised. So in this case, this was more, you know, it wasn't a guidance document, but the FDA is letting you know they're not considering coconut as part of the tree nut category. So it's different. It will have an impact. FDA guidance documents, even though they're not the law or they're not the regulation, it is pretty much what they use to enforce the regulations because it has been, these guidance documents have been created by experts in the industry with the FDA, and they are pretty much what the FDA is expecting you to either have or implement or follow. So they are very, very strongly recommended information. So when our clients come to us, we always, it's better to follow the FDA guidance. And if you don't, you better have evidence of why you're not doing it. And that evidence better demonstrate that you achieve a safe product or you achieve the same results FDA is expecting with following a different procedure. So if you're able to follow the guidance, you follow the guidance. But if you say, no, my process is better, my process achieves the same level of public health protection as that guidance is indicating, then you better have that evidence ready for the FDA. Okay. I have to sort through the questions, so it takes me just a moment. Okay, a lot of people want a copy of the presentation. You will receive a copy of the recording. Do not worry. What is the FDA's usual period of notice for inspecting a European-based dietary supplement producer? So the FDA, for any foreign inspection, it's going to be about 3 months. Now, this is just like the common expectation, but there might be cases where FDA has resources in other countries that conduct inspections for them. They can have agreements with different countries. So it's possible that some people might not receive any notice if FDA does not have to travel there, or, so it just depends. But if the FDA is sending someone from the United States to travel, they do need to arrange that travel and make sure that you're operating, that you exist. They're going to send you a questionnaire initially that you have to answer. So sometimes they'll reach out and say, yes, we're going to inspect now in May 15th. We're going to be at your facility. Please confirm availability. This is going to be the date. Okay, they can agree to that. Another time they say, okay, we reviewed the information and we're no longer going to do the inspection. It just depends on their travel schedule and the feasibility of visiting your facility. So just stay alert. As soon as you receive a notice of inspection, you must reply to the FDA within 5 days. Yes, it is received. We are, waiting on further instructions. They'll send a questionnaire. You have to fill it out with all the, most updated information. They will review that and get back to you. Philip Andrews says, please could you confirm if a UK-based wines and spirit merchant requires an FDA certificate to be able to export their products to the USA? You do not need an FDA certificate. You will need to comply with the TTB regulations. Wines and spirits are required to register. So if that's what you mean, you do need to register with the FDA in order, because you're holding or manufacturing a food, but they are not going to inspect you. You will fall under the TTB regulation. One moment. I see that some people were having issues with hearing the webinar. I'm not sure if everybody, or if that was just specific to some of you. If you weren't able to hear it at this time, the recording, might be helpful then. We will publish this also. In addition to sending it to you via email, we'll send it across different social platforms as well as YouTube, so you can find it there as well. Karina Pearson asked, does FDA recognize BRC equivalent to FDA food safety? If the foreign facility is certified BRC, would this be accepted by the FDA, or will FDA still want to audit the European facility? The FDA does not recognize BRC as equivalent to the FDA. There might be um, certain modules in different audit schemes that address FDA requirements. And even if you have that, the FDA would still conduct their own inspections. There can be, like I mentioned, put, they can have agreements with other countries. Like if you already had a specific uh, audit or inspection by your food safety authority, they may already rely on that inspection instead of having to go, because that agency will share information with the FDA. So there might be those types of agreements. There is also a different optional, how do I explain this? So there is an import program where you can expedite your shipments, and the FDA can rely on certain auditors to conduct FDA equivalent inspections. And you submit those inspections, the FDA will review, and it's VQIP, the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. But that's a little different, and you have to pay for that to be approved. But having those inspections, like third party inspections, does not mean the FDA will not inspect you. They will conduct their own inspections. Beatriz Garay is saying, if I don't have an FSVP, I can continue with the importing process, or will I not be able to release the product from port or customs? Beatriz, I don't know if you are outside the United States and are trying to export the product into the United States. If that's the case, you don't need to have an FSVP. You need an FSVP agent if you don't have a US importer that's purchasing the goods from you, but prior to entry. So by the time your product reaches entry, if you don't have a US buyer, you're just sending maybe to a warehouse, and then from the warehouse somebody might purchase it, then you need an FSVP agent to verify the compliance of that food and make sure that you are compliant with FDA. If you are in the US and you're an importer, you are required to have an FSVP for all the foods that you're importing. Um, so if your product is being sent and you don't have an FSVP importer or agent, the FDA cannot release that food until you do. So you're going to have to sort that out before you export the food to prevent any issues. So Michio Kato is saying, how long does a record remain if a ship is held, etc., by the FDA? Does it stay permanently? So yes. So if your shipments were refused, that information is on the FDA website, and there is information there for the past, I believe, since 2011 or 14. I can't remember the number right now, but it's a significant amount of data because you know the FDA is requiring importers to verify FDA compliance history of their foreign suppliers, so that information has to be made available. It's also made available to the general public because if I, as a consumer, don't want to purchase products that came from X manufacturer or X company, I have that available to make that decision. And the public must know who is following FDA regulations versus who isn't. So that information is there forever, I believe. Now, if you were placed on import alert, you can be removed from an import alert list. So your name will be removed from the list, but you would still be able to know that you were on import alert at some point. Yeah, so Ilka Sasaki says, our manufacturer was inspected. We responded that we will correct the points that the inspector raised. After that, we haven't heard from the FDA since December. What should we do? So Ilka, if you can send a follow-up just to, ask questions to your inspector, that is allowed. That's no problem. Sometimes there is delays in the process and FDA can sort of pop up out of nowhere and give you an update, but sometimes they might just not respond. Once an inspection is conducted, there is also an inspection report that they are working on. So if you did get that 483, then once that has been reviewed, all the information is given to other FDA personnel that will evaluate the inspection, will evaluate the report that the inspector developed or drafted, and they will give an official classification to your inspection. So the classification is like the grade that you received. So if there were no observations or no 483, you would receive a no action indicated. Now, when you receive a 483, it will be a voluntary action indicated. That 483 tells you these are the observations. We are asking you to voluntarily fix them. Now, the other action could be official action indicated, where the FDA is saying, no, these are very serious observations. You're in serious violation of the FDA requirements. Your food is deemed unsafe, and can have a big impact in food safety. So we're giving you official action indicated, and you are required to fix it. Or they can go ahead and take other action, like, giving you warning letters and also placing you on import alert or suspending your registration. But that's not the case. I just went on a little tangent to explain to everybody what the process of classification looks like. But if you haven't heard back since December, just send them an email and ask for an update and see what they say. But sometimes they might just not reply at all, and they just continued with their processes. But you should receive an establishment inspection report within about 3 to 6 months of your inspection, where your classification is officially provided to you and also published in the FDA data dashboard. Janice Radomski asks, is Registrar Corp offering FSVP agent services? Yes. So because Registrar Corp as FSVP agent would be responsible for assuming FSVP importer responsibilities, then it requires a pre-approval of your your business as in regards to FDA compliance and your product categories. So it's important that if you need an FSVP agent, you come to us for an evaluation as soon as possible. If you're shipping like next week, that is an impossible scenario for us to approve you as an FSVP, to be your FSVP agent. So, for example, we get a lot of requests for trade shows that pop up suddenly. Oh, I'm sending my product for this trade show and it's in 2 weeks. And that's very tight constraint for us to request all the documentation that is required, conduct the evaluations and verification activities. So if you require an FSVP agent, act as soon as you know that you're planning to export to the United States and you don't have a buyer. That's the time where you say, okay, let me start searching for my FSVP agent so I can fix any compliance issues that they find and they can approve me so I can send my products by the time that I want. It's not something that can be done overnight or done quickly. We've also seen cases where people say, yeah, for $100, I'll be your FSVP agent, send me your registration number, and that's it. That's not a legitimate FSVP agent. FSVP agents are required by the FSVP regulation to evaluate suppliers for compliance, evaluate their FDA compliance history, verify that they're complying with the specific regulations like preventive controls for human or animal food and low acid canned foods or FCE, or if they're dietary supplements, they must evaluate that you're in compliance. That requires thorough evaluation of your food safety documentation, your product specifications, your process flow diagram. If you have third-party audit reports, they must evaluate that to determine compliance before you ship. So all of that, we have that often, that misconception that this can be a quick process, but unfortunately it's not. So we encourage you that if you're thinking, oh, I want to send this seasonal product for summer, now is the time where you start looking for an FSVP agent so that all the evaluations can be conducted. The best part about using Registrar Corp for this process is because of our expertise with FDA regulations, different from somebody else, is that we can identify issues. So if we say we cannot approve you right now because you're not in compliance, but we have food safety plan services to help you have a compliant food safety plan. We have label review services so that we ensure that your labels are compliant. We have, consulting. We have online training as well, so that if you don't have a person that's trained in the proper FDA requirements, we have training for that. So we can build you up, get you compliant, and then we can approve you. So we don't just leave you hanging dry, but we need time to do that for you and work with you. So be very cognizant of that for FSVP agent. If anybody out there is telling you, oh, I just need a written assurance, telling me you're compliant, that that could apply if you are a qualified facility. Remember, we talked about exemptions. There can be exemptions if you're a qualified facility. You don't need a food safety plan. So when we evaluate you, we won't require you to have a food safety plan because you have that exemption. So those exemptions matter. It's important that you know your business, you understand where you fall, so that it can expedite other processes as well if you are benefiting from those exemptions. I'm happy to see some people are going to watch the Spanish version. I also provide the Spanish version, so I'm happy to see that. Looking forward to that. Question by Henry Capeden. Can you help with getting DUNS number for non-US facilities? Absolutely. As part of our Food Facility Registration US agent services, we also expedite the DUNS process for you. So yeah, absolutely. We also help with that. Okay, so Irene Mela says we are a little Italian facility, less than 10 employees, less than $1 million. We are now exempt from the food safety plan and I believe the supply chain program. If in 2025 we reach the $1 million, excuse me, of incomes, how long do we have to prepare? One, yeah, I apologize. I'm getting better from a cold. If in 25 we reach the $1 million of incomes, how long do we have to prepare the food safety plan and be in compliance with the FDA regulations? So if you reach the $1 million in 1 year, that does not automatically make you a large facility. It has to be the average of the past 3 years. So if you were to calculate now, you would consider what you made in 2024, 2023, and 2022. You would average that, and if it exceeds the 1 million, then you would have to comply, and you will no longer be a very small business. So once you exceed that, the FDA does have a period where once you start producing a product that you're sending to the United States, you have a period to validate your food safety plan. I believe that is 90 days or 60 days. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact number. I can't remember it right now, but there is a period where they allow you to develop your food safety plan and you have a validation, to validate your food safety plan. So you do have some time. However, you want to do that as soon as possible. It is, like I mentioned, most facilities already have a HACCP plan in place because, when you're producing food, it would be very, very irresponsible not to have something in place to make sure that the procedures are consistently followed, that if you have a heat step, that the heat step is consistently, the parameters of time and temperature are consistently met to make sure that the product is either cooked thoroughly or pasteurized, etc. So, most facilities have something because you just can't operate without any plan. So, just you already should have something. It's a matter of then transforming that into what FDA requires. If you are subject to preventive controls, then make sure that you have all your supply chain controls, sanitation controls, allergen controls, process preventive controls in place. That you're monitoring what the FDA requires you to monitor at each preventive control, and we can certainly help you. Like if you wanted to start that process, and we have the checks, like I mentioned, check reports they're called, and they are very simple observations of your current food safety plan. And these are just a list, and we give you justification, and then you can start with that. But if you already want to move to having the full food safety plan developed, then we also have that service for you. So it just depends. But yeah, you have, I would say, from 30 to 90 days, because I can't remember the exact number right now, to have your food safety plan validated. Now, let me take just one more question. And thank you for joining. I don't believe I don't remember if I thank you for joining and tuning in with us today, but I'm very grateful. We've had very good attendance, and I'm so happy that this information is reaching so many people. So the gender Thakur is asking, we manufacture fatty acid and specifically lauric acid, which is not food but will be used in animal feed. So my question is, does food safety rules and regulations apply to us also? Yes, you are manufacturing an ingredient that will be used in animal food. So it is considered a food. Food, the definition of food includes ingredients and the product itself. So it's important that we know that distinction as well. So in this case, lauric acid will be subject to the preventive controls regulation for animal food. Okay, so Ben Plata asked, what documents should we maintain to be prepared for an FDA inspection, and how can we ensure our supply chain partners comply with FDA food safety standards? So Ben, I'm not sure what type of operation you have, but if you are subject to preventive controls, so you're not making seafood or juice or dietary supplements, the documents that you should maintain are a food safety plan, and that food safety plan must have a hazard analysis and the procedures for preventive controls. You also must follow GMPs. So there are certain GMP procedures that those procedures need to be in writing. The FDA could request to see any procedure. Oh, what's your procedure for, storing food? And what is your procedure for employee hygiene? Or what is your procedure for employee training? So they might request those GMP documents at their discretion, whichever they feel are relevant and important for the inspection. Within the food safety plan, there are different preventive controls. So if you are required to have also supply chain controls, that means you must have a supply chain program. Your supply chain program is how you evaluate and approve your suppliers when they are controlling hazards that you are not controlling. So let's say you're receiving milk and your process is, you're mixing that to make something else, but you're not engaging in pasteurization, for example. You will rely on your supplier to pasteurize that milk before it reaches your facility, and there's no control after that. So that is a case where the supply chain program would require you to verify suppliers. The way that you verify that is by excuse me, you have to, check their history to see if they've had any issues in the past with compliance or food safety. You could find out within your country or another country's uh, agency's website which facilities have been on recalls, for example. Let's say, oh, that milk was associated to a recall due to drug residue, so I don't want that supplier. Or if I do go with that supplier, then I'm going to check for drug residues in that milk at every shipment to make sure that it doesn't have it. So that's how you sort of start that supplier evaluation and approval program. In addition to verifying their compliance, you also have to have a hazard analysis for that food. So you identify, okay, the hazard that they're controlling are the pathogenic bacteria because they're pasteurizing. They're also supposed to verify the drug residues are not there. They're also controlling for, let's say, physical hazards. If your process is simple and you don't have, any, let's say, like metal hazards and you don't have a metal detector, then you're also relying on them to, it can be a different things, but you have to evaluate the supplier, evaluate the product type to see which hazards apply, what hazards are controlled by the supplier, and therefore know what you have to control, in addition to verifying that they have controlled what they're supposed to. So that's part of the food safety plan, supply chain program. They will verify your recall plan. Again, I mentioned the GMP procedures. Those are the types of documents. But then within the facility walkthrough, and we will go this into our fourth webinar, which is the one about inspection. So I hope that you will also tune into that one. Um, they will walk around and make sure that the operations are following good manufacturing practices. Your employees have the proper garments, they are following the procedures for their CCPs, they are following good hygienic practices. So yeah, all of that will be in the walkthrough in addition to the document review. So with that question, I conclude the question and answer session. Thank you so much for joining, and we hope to see you in our second webinar in March 6th of 2025. So thank you so much. Have a great day.